In the heart of 18th century France, when the light of the Enlightenment was supposed to be driving away the shadows of superstition, when reason and philosophy were supposedly conquering the ancient fears of humankind, a darkness descended upon a remote corner of the kingdom. A darkness that walked on four legs, that struck with teeth and claws, and that would leave behind it a trail of blood so deep and so terrible that its memory would echo down through the centuries. The province of Gévaudan lies in the heart of south-central France, a wild and isolated region of granite plateaus, volcanic peaks, and deep river gorges. Today, most of this ancient territory makes up the modern department of Lozère, one of the most sparsely populated regions in all of France. But even in the middle of the 18th century, Gévaudan was a place that seemed to exist outside of time, a frontier where civilization had not yet fully tamed the forces of nature. The landscape itself was a study in contrasts and extremes. The margerie mountains rose from the earth like the bones of some ancient giant, their slopes covered in dense forests of oak and beech that had stood since before the Romans came. Between the mountains lay vast highland meadows, the kind of open country where a shepherd could see for miles but feel utterly alone. Rivers carved deep channels through the volcanic rock, their waters pure and cold, running through gorges where the sunlight barely reached. In winter, snow buried the high country under drifts that could trap an entire hamlet for months. In summer, the sun beat down on the exposed plateaus with an intensity that cracked the earth and turned the grass to gold. This was not fertile farmland. The soil was too rocky, too thin, too stubborn to yield much in the way of crops. The people of Gévaudan lived as they had for centuries, as shepherds and herders, following their flocks of sheep and cattle to the high pastures in the warm months and bringing them back down to the valleys when winter came. It was a hard life, a life that demanded resilience and a certain fierce independence. These were not the soft courtiers of Versailles. These were people who knew hunger, who knew cold, who knew that nature was not some romantic ideal but a force that could kill you if you made a single mistake. The villages were small and scattered, connected by rough tracks that turned to mud in the spring rains and were often impassable in winter. Most people never traveled more than a few miles from the place where they were born. News from the outside world came slowly, carried by peddlers and traveling priests. The grand events unfolding in Paris or London or Vienna might as well have been happening on another planet for all the impact they had on daily life in the mountains of Gévaudan. But one event had touched this remote corner of France, had reached even into these isolated valleys, and left its mark. The 7 Years' War had recently ended, that great global conflict that had raged from the forests of North America to the plains of India. France had lost badly, and the cost had been staggering. The treasury was empty. The young men who had marched away to fight for king and country had not all come home. Those who did return brought with them wounds, both visible and invisible, and stories of horrors witnessed on distant battlefields. The war had left the nation exhausted, impoverished, and looking for something, anything, to distract from the humiliation of defeat and the grinding misery of poverty. The newspapers, those new organs of public opinion that were beginning to shape the consciousness of the age, were hungry for stories. The great military campaigns were over. The peace treaties had been signed. The presses needed something new, something sensational, something that would make people buy papers and talk in the streets and coffee houses. They were about to get a story beyond anything they could have imagined. The year was 1764, and in the province of Gévaudan, the world was about to change forever. It began, as so many tales of terror begin, with an attack that was dismissed, an encounter that was not believed until it was far too late. In the early summer of 1764, a young woman was tending cattle in the Mercoeur forest near the town of Langon, in the eastern part of Gévaudan. She was doing what generations of her family had done before her, what thousands of young people across the province did every day. She was watching the herd, making sure none of the animals strayed too far. keeping an eye out for the wolves that were an ever-present danger in these forested mountains. She saw it come toward her from the trees. At first, she might have thought it was a wolf. Wolves were common enough in Gévaudan, and attacks on livestock happened with grim regularity. But as the creature drew closer, she realized this was something different, something wrong. Years later, those who heard her story would remember her description. It was like a wolf, she said, but not a wolf. It was larger than any wolf she had ever seen, nearly as big as one of the calves in her herd. Its build was all wrong, too muscular, too broad across the chest. Its fur was a strange reddish-brown color with dark streaks running along its sides and a prominent dark stripe down the length of its spine. Its tail was longer and thicker than a wolf's tail, ending in a tuft of hair. And its head, its terrible head, was massive, with a mouth that seemed too wide, filled with teeth that gleamed white against the dark lips. But it was not interested in the cattle. It was interested in her. The creature charged. The young woman screamed, and the bulls in the herd reacted with the protective instinct that had been bred into them over countless generations. They wheeled around and charged back at the beast, their heads lowered, their horns ready to gore and trample. The creature was forced to retreat. It tried again, circling, looking for an opening, but the bulls were not having it. They kept themselves between the predator and the woman, bellowing their challenge, pawing the ground with their massive hooves. Finally, the beast gave up and disappeared back into the forest. The young woman was shaken but alive. She went home and told her story, and like so many victims who would come after her, she was not entirely believed. It was a wolf, people likely said, just a large wolf. Perhaps she had been frightened, and it seemed bigger than it was. These things happen. But then, just days later, on the 30th of June, 1764, the beast struck again. And this time, there would be no doubt. This time, there would be no escape. 14-year-old Jeanne Boulet was tending her family's sheep near the village of Les Houbacs, not far from where the first woman had been attacked. She was alone, as was common for shepherdesses in that time and place. Children as young as 5 or 6 were put to work watching over livestock, often without any adult supervision, often miles from the nearest house. It was simply the way life was lived in these harsh mountains. The beast came for her in the middle of the day. There was no warning, no chance to run. It struck with a speed and savagery that would become its terrible signature. When her body was found, the sight was so horrific that grown men turned away. Her throat had been torn out. She had been killed with devastating violence. She had been partially consumed. The next day, July 1st, Jeanne Boulet was buried in the churchyard. The parish register records the event in stark, terrible language. She was buried without sacraments, it notes, because she could not confess before her death. But then the register adds a detail that would prove to be the beginning of a legend. She was killed by the ferocious beast, it states, using a phrase that would soon be on everyone's lips. La bête féroce, the ferocious beast. The use of that word, beast, was significant. The scribe could have written wolf, he could have written wild animal, but he chose beast, a word that carried with it an echo of something more than natural, something that belonged in the old stories, the dark tales that mothers whispered to their children to keep them close to home after nightfall. And the attacks did not stop. They were only beginning. Throughout the late summer and into autumn of 1764, more attacks came in the Mercoeur forest and the surrounding countryside. Most of the victims were women and children, often caught alone while tending livestock in the fields or forests. The attacks were savage beyond anything that hunters and farmers familiar with wolf predation had ever seen. The beast seemed to target the head and neck with a single-minded ferocity. Throats were torn out. Victims were killed with devastating force. In some cases, the victims were partially eaten. In others, they were simply killed and left behind, as if the creature killed for pleasure rather than for food. This was not the behavior of a normal predator. A wolf, even a rabid wolf, killed to eat. It did not stage its victims. It did not display the kind of focused brutality that witnesses were describing. The people of Gévaudan had lived with wolves for as long as anyone could remember. They knew what a wolf attack looked like. This was not that. This was something else. Something that did not fit into their understanding of the natural world. Terror began to spread through the province like a dark fog rolling down from the mountains. Parents kept their children close to home. Shepherds began traveling in groups, armed with whatever weapons they could find. Pikes, pitchforks, clubs studded with nails. Church bells were rung when someone spotted the creature, a warning to everyone within earshot to take shelter. But the warnings rarely came in time. The beast moved with a speed and cunning that suggested an intelligence far beyond that of a simple animal. By late December of 1764, after 6 months of attacks, the death toll was rising rapidly, and something else was becoming clear to the terrified populace. There might not be just one beast. There might be 2 of them, or even more. The attacks were happening too frequently, over too wide an area, for a single animal to be responsible. Witnesses began reporting seeing the creature in places that were miles apart, sometimes on the same day, sometimes at nearly the same hour. Some claimed to have seen 2 beasts together, hunting as a pair. The pattern suggested that multiple animals might be involved in the terror. The reality was settling in. The province of Gévaudan was not facing a single rogue predator. It was facing something worse. It was facing a reign of terror that showed no signs of ending. As the attacks continued and the body count rose, people naturally tried to understand what they were facing. Survivors, those few who had encountered the beast and lived to tell the tale, provided descriptions. Hunters who caught glimpses of the creature as it fled into the forest added their observations. And from these scattered accounts, a portrait began to emerge of something that defied easy categorization. The beast, witnesses agreed, was enormous. Some said it was as large as a calf. Others claimed it was the size of a young cow. Even allowing for the tendency of frightened people to exaggerate, it was clear that this was no ordinary canid. The largest wolves known to exist in Europe rarely exceeded 140 pounds. The creature terrorizing Gévaudan was described as being substantially larger than that. Its fur was reddish-brown or tawny in color, marked with dark streaks along the sides, and a prominent black stripe running the length of its back, from head to tail. This coloration was unusual for a wolf, which typically had more uniform gray or brown fur. The dark dorsal stripe was particularly noted by multiple witnesses, a detail that would later fuel speculation about the beast's true identity. The tail was described as being longer and thicker than a wolf's tail, ending in a distinctive tuft of hair. The creature appeared to use its tail as it moved, a feature that caught the attention of those who saw it. The head was massive and out of proportion to the body, with a broad snout, pointed ears that stood erect, and a mouth that seemed impossibly wide. The teeth were the subject of particular horror in the accounts. They were larger and more formidable than those of a typical wolf. The beast's bite was devastating, capable of inflicting terrible wounds. The chest was unusually broad and muscular, giving the creature a powerful upper body that was very different from the rangy, lean build of a typical wolf. The overall appearance, based on these collective descriptions, was of an animal that resembled a wolf but possessed characteristics that seemed unusual or out of place. But it was not just the physical appearance that set this creature apart. It was the behavior, the intelligence, the sheer focused violence that seemed to drive it. The beast was an ambush predator. It did not simply chase down prey like a normal wolf. It stalked, it waited, it chose its moments with a calculation that suggested a frightening degree of intelligence. It seemed to deliberately target the most vulnerable members of society, women and children who were alone and defenseless. Adult men, particularly those who were armed or in groups, were rarely attacked. The pattern suggested that the creature understood the difference, that it could calculate risk and reward. It attacked in daylight as often as at night, which was unusual behavior for a wolf. Wolves are naturally wary of humans and typically avoid contact during the day when visibility is high. The beast showed no such caution. It would strike in the middle of the afternoon, in open fields, sometimes within sight of houses and villages. It seemed to have no fear of humans whatsoever. And then there were the truly disturbing details, the ones that pushed the attacks from the realm of the merely brutal into something that felt almost supernatural. Witnesses reported that the beast could make incredible leaps, jumping over fences and stone walls with apparent ease. Some claimed it could stand on its hind legs, at least briefly. Others swore they had seen it shrug off musket fire, that bullets seemed to have little effect on it even when they struck home. These accounts of apparent invulnerability had a profound effect on the psychology of the population. If the beast could not be killed, if it was immune to the weapons that men possessed, then what hope was there? Was this a natural creature at all? Or was it something else? Something that belonged to the realm of the supernatural, the demonic, the cursed? The superstitious beliefs of rural 18th century France provided ready-made explanations for the unexplainable. Werewolves, those shapeshifters of legend who could transform from man to beast and back again, were still very much a part of the collective consciousness. The last major werewolf trial in France had taken place less than a century before. The stories were still told around winter fires, the warnings still given to children. Do not wander in the forest at night. Do not trust the stranger with the strange eyes. The loup-garou, the werewolf, is always watching, always waiting. And there were other beliefs, darker beliefs. Some whispered that the beast was a divine punishment, a scourge sent by God to chastise the people of Gévaudan for their sins. This was the age of religious tension in France, a time when Catholics and Protestants still viewed each other with suspicion and hatred. Some preachers were quick to suggest that the beast was God's judgment. Others took a broader view, arguing that the sins of all the people, the pride, the greed, the neglect of proper worship, had called down divine wrath in the form of this terrible creature. It was this theological interpretation that was seized upon by one of the most powerful men in the province. Gabriel Florent de Choiseul-Beaupré was the Bishop of Mende and, by virtue of that office, also held the temporal title relating to Gévaudan. He was a man of the old aristocracy, connected by blood to some of the most powerful families in France, including the king's own ministers. He was also a man of deep religious conviction, influenced by theological movements that emphasized human sinfulness, divine grace, and the need for constant repentance. On the 31st of December, 1764, as the old year died and a new year of terror was about to begin, Bishop Choiseul-Beaupré issued a mandate that would be read from every pulpit in his diocese. It was a document that combined pastoral care, theological interpretation, and a call to collective action. But most of all, it was a document that gave the attacks a religious meaning, a cosmic significance that elevated them from mere animal predations to a kind of sacred drama. In this mandate, the bishop described the beast as potentially a scourge sent by God to punish the people for their sins. He drew on biblical and theological traditions, invoking concepts of divine justice and punishment for human wickedness. He cited scripture, including passages that spoke of God using wild beasts to chastise his people when they turned away from righteousness. The mandate ordered that special prayers be said in every church in the diocese. The Blessed Sacrament was to be exposed for veneration. The 40 hours devotion, a period of continuous prayer and contemplation, was to be observed. The people were called to examine their consciences, to confess their sins, to make acts of penance and reparation. Through a collective turning back to God, the bishop argued, the scourge might be lifted. The mandate was a powerful piece of rhetoric, and it had a profound effect on the population. Churches filled with people praying for deliverance. Processions wound through villages, the faithful carrying crosses and holy relics. singing hymns and litanies, begging God to spare them from the beast. It was a scene that would not have been out of place in earlier centuries, a moment when the modern world seemed to fall away and the old fears, the old beliefs came rushing back. But the prayers did not stop the beast. The holy processions did not drive it away. The attacks continued through January, through February, through the spring of 1765. If anything, they intensified. The creature seemed to mock the efforts of both the church and the state to stop it. It killed with impunity, struck where and when it pleased, and vanished like smoke whenever organized hunts tried to track it down. The people of Gévaudan were learning a terrible lesson. They were alone. Heaven and earth, God and King, had not yet saved them. If they were to survive, they would have to find their own courage. In the face of overwhelming terror, when institutions fail and authority proves slow to act, it is often the ordinary people, the ones with no power or prestige, who show the greatest courage. The story of the Beast of Gévaudan is filled with such moments, with acts of bravery that shine like small lights in the gathering darkness. One of the most remarkable of these acts took place on the 12th of January, 1765. A group of children from the village of Villaret, in the parish of Chanelaise, were out watching cattle on one of the high hills of Gévaudan. There were 7 of them in total, 5 boys and 2 girls, ranging in age from 8 to 12 years old. The oldest and the leader of the group was a boy named Jacques-André Portefeuille, 12 years old and standing just 4.5 feet tall. Like most children in that place and time, they had been put to work young. They carried simple weapons, wooden staffs with short iron blades mounted at the tip, 4 inches of sharpened metal that could be used to drive off stray dogs or, in theory, defend against wolves. But they were children armed with children's weapons, and when the beast came for them, they had every reason to run screaming and abandon their charges. They did not run. They saw it when it was already close, materializing from the landscape with that terrible speed that so many witnesses described. The children reacted with an instinct born of desperation and absolute clarity of purpose. They gathered together in a tight defensive formation. They crossed themselves, that ancient gesture of faith and protection. They drew their small weapons and prepared to fight. The beast circled them, studying them with those intelligent, calculating eyes that survivors always mentioned. It was testing them, looking for weakness, for the moment of panic when the formation would break and it could isolate one of them. But the children held steady. Portefeuille, small and young as he was, kept them together, kept their courage from breaking. The beast rushed in and grabbed one of the youngest boys, Joseph Panafieu, who was only 8 years old. It seized him, its jaws closing around him. The 3 older boys, Portefeuille, Jacques Cousteau, and Jean Pic, immediately attacked, stabbing at the creature with their small blades. They later reported that the iron points seemed unable to pierce the beast's hide easily, as if it were protected somehow. But they stabbed and stabbed anyway, and the fury of their attack, the sheer determination, forced the beast to release Joseph. It stepped back, and to the horror of the children, it consumed the piece of flesh it had torn from Joseph in front of them. Then it attacked again, even more furiously. It knocked down the youngest boy, Jean Verrier, and grabbed him, trying to drag him away. Again, the older boys attacked, led by Portefeuille, and again they forced the beast to release its prey. The beast retreated a short distance, and the children, showing a tactical awareness that belied their age, began moving as a group toward a marshy area about 50 feet away. They understood that if they could reach the bog, the uncertain footing would slow the creature down and might give them a chance to drive it off for good. The beast came after them, grabbing Jean Verrier once more and trying to carry him off. And, once more, the children attacked as one, stabbing, striking, never breaking formation, never abandoning their companion. They reached the edge of the marsh, and the beast, finding itself in difficult terrain and facing prey that simply refused to give up, finally retreated and disappeared into the landscape. The children had won. 7 children, armed with nothing but small knives and absolute courage, had driven off the terror of Gévaudan. 2 of them were wounded, but all 7 were alive. The story of Jacques Portefeuille and his companions spread across France like wildfire. It reached the ears of King Louis XV himself, who was moved by the account of such bravery. The king awarded 300 livres to Portefeuille and another 350 livres to be divided among his 6 companions. More than that, he decreed that Portefeuille would be educated at the state's expense, an extraordinary opportunity for a peasant boy from the mountains. The gesture seemed intended to honor those who had protected themselves when the crown had not yet been able to protect them. But Portefeuille was not the only hero to emerge from the terror. Several months later, on the 11th of August, 1765, another act of courage took place that would earn its protagonist a place in legend. Marie-Jeanne Vallée was 19 or 20 years old, a servant working in the area. She and others were near a small stream when the beast appeared. While accounts vary slightly in their details, what is consistently recorded is that Marie-Jeanne stood her ground when the creature attacked. She was carrying a weapon, described in various accounts as a bayonet mounted on a pole or a similar implement, and when the beast came at her, she thrust it forward with all her strength, driving the blade deep into the creature's chest. The beast screamed, a sound that witnesses would later say was unlike anything they had ever heard from an animal. It fell back, clearly wounded, blood pouring from the injury. The beast then fled into the woods, leaving a trail of blood behind it. François Antoine, the royal huntsman who had been sent to kill the beast and who had been tracking it for months, heard about the attack and went to investigate. He examined the weapon and found it covered in blood. He followed the blood trail and confirmed that it matched the tracks of the beast. In his correspondence with the king's ministers, Antoine praised Marie-Jeanne's courage, comparing her to heroic figures from French history. He called her the Maid of Gévaudan, a title that captured the imagination of the public. Unlike Jacques Portefeuille, Marie-Jeanne Vallée did not receive a royal reward, no money, no offer of advancement. The recognition she received was primarily in the form of fame and local gratitude. But in the folk memory of the region, her story has never been forgotten. In 1995, a statue was erected showing Marie-Jeanne standing firm, weapon in hand, facing down the beast. It stands as a monument to courage in the face of unspeakable terror. There were other acts of bravery as well. Other moments when ordinary people refused to become victims. When the beast was spotted, groups of local hunters would pursue it, sometimes managing to corner it long enough to fire their muskets. On one such occasion near the Château de la Baume, hunters drove the beast into an open field and opened fire with their muskets, a volley of shots. The beast fell. And then, to the horror of the hunters, it stood back up, shook itself, and ran off into the forest. Whether the shots had missed vital areas or the beast's thick hide had deflected poorly aimed fire, the result was the same. The creature had survived what should have been a fatal encounter. But what these acts of courage did do, what the stories of Portefeuille and Vallée and all the others who fought back accomplished, was to give people hope. They proved that the beast, whatever it was, could be hurt, it could be driven off, it could bleed, and if it could bleed, then perhaps, someday, someone would find a way to make it die. The attacks in Gévaudan were not just a local tragedy. They were becoming an international embarrassment for France. By the spring of 1765, news of the beast had spread far beyond the borders of the province. This was the age of the newspaper, when printed news sheets were beginning to shape public opinion across Europe and even beyond. The Courrier d'Avignon, the regional paper that first covered the story extensively, had been picked up by publications in Paris, then by papers in London, Brussels, and cities across the continent. The Beast of Gévaudan was becoming one of the first true media sensations of the modern age, a story that gripped the public imagination and sold newspapers by the thousands. For the French monarchy, this was a disaster. France had just lost the 7 Years' War, a humiliating defeat that had cost the nation its colonial empire in North America and significant territories elsewhere. The treasury was empty. The military had been beaten. The national pride was wounded. And now, to add insult to injury, the entire world was reading about how the mighty kingdom of France could not protect its own people from a wild animal. The English press, in particular, had a field day with the story. English journalists, never ones to miss an opportunity to mock their traditional enemies across the channel, wrote scathing articles about the apparent impotence of royal power in the face of a beast. What did this say about French might? What did it say about the effectiveness of the French government? The pressure on King Louis XV was immense. He had to be seen to be doing something, had to demonstrate that the monarchy had not lost all authority and effectiveness. And so, in the autumn of 1764, the royal court began to take action. The first response was to send military forces. Captain Jean-Baptiste Duhamel of the Clermont Prince Dragoons was dispatched to Gévaudan with a contingent of his men in October of 1764. Duhamel was zealous in his efforts, organizing massive hunts involving thousands of local volunteers. Contemporary accounts suggest that tens of thousands of men were at various times enrolled in the effort to hunt down the beast, though the exact numbers are difficult to verify, and likely included many who participated only briefly or sporadically. But Duhamel faced problems from the start. The local population, while desperate to have the beast killed, were not always cooperative with outside authorities. Some were suspicious of soldiers from outside the region. The terrain itself was a nightmare for organized military operations. The forests were dense and trackless. The mountains were steep and dangerous. The beast knew this landscape intimately and used it to its advantage. Duhamel came close several times. There were hunts where the beast was spotted, chased, cornered. Shots were fired. Blood was found. And then the creature would vanish, as if it had simply dissolved into the earth. The captain's frustration was evident in his correspondence. By early 1765, it was clear that Duhamel was not going to succeed on his own. The king decided to send professional wolf hunters, men who made their living tracking and killing these predators. In February of 1765, Jean-Charles Marc-Antoine Vaumessel d'Enneval and his son Jean-François arrived with 8 bloodhounds that had been specially trained for wolf hunting. The d'Ennevals were confident. The father boasted that he had killed over 1,200 wolves in his career. Wolves were what they knew, what they had spent their lives studying and hunting. Surely, they thought, this Beast of Gévaudan, no matter how large or cunning, was fundamentally a wolf. They were wrong, or at least unsuccessful. The d'Ennevals hunted for 4 months, from February through May of 1765. They tracked across the mountains. They set traps. They used their bloodhounds. They killed wolves, many wolves, ordinary wolves that were indeed a problem in the region. But they did not kill the beast. The attacks continued. The death toll continued to rise. Part of the problem appears to have been cultural and logistical. The d'Ennevals were from Normandy, from the north of France. They did not speak the local dialect fluently. They did not understand the local terrain as intimately as needed. They also had difficulties coordinating with Captain Duhamel and local authorities. The lack of cooperation hindered the hunt. By June of 1765, the king had had enough. The d'Ennevals were quietly dismissed and sent home. The court needed a new solution, a new champion, and so they turned to one of their own, a man who was part of the royal household itself. François Antoine was the king's arquebusier, his gun-bearer, a member of the royal household, a knight of the Royal Military Order of St. Louis. He was 71 years old, but still vigorous, and still considered one of the finest huntsmen in France. When he arrived in the village of Le Malzieu, On the 22nd of June, 1765, he brought with him a hunting party that included gamekeepers from the royal hunting preserves and his own hunting dogs. Antoine was not just a hunter. He was a courtier, a man who understood that his mission was as much about politics and public relations as it was about killing a predator. He knew that the king needed a victory, needed to demonstrate to France and to the world that royal power was effective, that the monarchy could protect its subjects. He wrote letters to Versailles regularly, detailing his efforts, describing the beast, requesting additional resources. And unlike his predecessors, Antoine appears to have taken the accounts of the local people seriously. He listened to the descriptions of the beast. He noted the unusual details, the size, the coloration, the tail, the apparent difficulty of bringing it down with musket fire. He treated these reports as intelligence that could be used to track and kill his quarry. Antoine organized systematic hunts, using techniques that had been perfected over centuries on the royal estates. He employed lines of beaters to drive animals toward waiting guns. He used his dogs to track and corner prey. He studied the pattern of attacks, trying to predict where the beast would strike next, and he came tantalizingly close, multiple times, to catching the creature. The attacks continued through the summer of 1765. More victims fell. The terror showed no signs of abating. The pressure on Antoine from Versailles was increasing. The king wanted results. The newspapers wanted their story resolved. And then, on the 21st of September, 1765, everything changed. The hunt that would make François Antoine's reputation and, temporarily at least, end the reign of terror in Gévaudan began in the area near the Royal Abbey of Chazes. Antoine had organized a large hunting party with beaters and hunters. The tactic was to surround an area, send in dogs and beaters to drive out any animals, and have hunters waiting to shoot. A large wolf was driven out of the thicket where it had been hiding. It ran toward the line of hunters, and multiple shots were fired. The creature fell. This time, it did not get back up. François Antoine walked forward to examine his kill, and what he saw before him seemed to be the answer to all the suffering. It was an enormous wolf, one of the largest ever recorded in France. Contemporary accounts describe it as being exceptionally large, though the exact measurements reported vary. Its coat was described as having unusual coloring. Its head was massive. Its teeth were formidable. In many ways, it matched descriptions that had been given by survivors of the beast's attacks. Antoine had the wolf immediately examined and then preserved. The skin was carefully treated. The body was stuffed for display. This was the proof, the evidence that would demonstrate to the king and to the world that the mission had been accomplished. On the 20th of September, just a day before the kill, Antoine wrote to the king's minister. After the successful hunt on the 21st, he sent word that he believed he had killed the creature responsible for the attacks. The response from Versailles was enthusiastic. Finally, after months of embarrassment, there was a victory to announce. Antoine made the journey to Versailles with his trophy. The skin and the stuffed body of the wolf were presented at court so that the nobility could see for themselves. Antoine recounted the story of the hunt. It was everything that Louis XV wanted. A narrative of royal power triumphant, of the king's personal huntsmen succeeding where others had failed. As a reward for his service, François Antoine was granted a substantial sum of money and recognition. He would go down in history as the man who killed the Beast of Gévaudan. The newspapers across France and Europe printed the news. The beast was dead. The terror was over. The people of Gévaudan could finally sleep peacefully at night, knowing that the creature would never kill again. For a brief period, this seemed to be true. The attacks stopped. October passed with no new victims. November came and went, and still there were no reports. The winter of 1765 to 1766 was quiet. People began to relax, to let down their guard, to believe that the nightmare was truly over. But in the forests and mountains of Gévaudan, something was stirring. something that had perhaps been lying low, perhaps healing from wounds, perhaps waiting for the attention to die down and the hunters to leave. Because the beast, or a beast very much like it, was not dead. On the 2nd of December, 1765, barely 2 months after Francois Antoine had presented his trophy wolf to the king, the attacks resumed. 2 young boys were attacked near their village. One was 6 years old, the other 12. The beast attempted to carry off the younger boy, but the older one fought it off. Both survived, but the message was clear and terrifying. The killings had started again. More attacks followed through December and into the new year. The horror that had just begun to fade from the collective memory came rushing back with renewed force. It was the beast. It had returned. Or perhaps, more terrifyingly, it had never left. The implications were clear to the people of Gévaudan. The wolf that Antoine had killed in September was just a wolf. A large and unusual wolf, certainly, but not the creature that had been responsible for the attacks. Perhaps there had been 2 beasts all along, and Antoine had only killed one of them. Or perhaps the animal he killed had never been the true beast at all. The attacks through the winter and spring of 1766 were, if anything, more brutal than before. The creature maintained the pattern it had established, targeting vulnerable victims, often women and children who were alone, striking with devastating force, and then vanishing before organized resistance could arrive. The psychological impact on the population was profound. They had been told the nightmare was over. They had believed, however tentatively, that they were safe. Now that fragile sense of security had been shattered. If the king's own huntsman, with all his skill and resources, had failed to kill the true beast, then who could succeed? If the creature could survive the most determined efforts of the crown, then what hope did ordinary people have? At Versailles, the return of the attacks was an embarrassment that the court was desperate to manage. The official position was one of denial or reinterpretation. The creature that Antoine had killed was the beast, the court maintained. These new attacks must be the work of different wolves. Ordinary wolves that were being mistaken for the original beast by a population that was still traumatized by their experiences. The king had solved the problem. This new outbreak was a separate issue entirely, but the people of Gévaudan knew better. They had seen the beast before, and they were seeing it again. The descriptions matched. The behavior matched. The same focused violence, the same targeting of the vulnerable, the same terrifying efficiency. They did not need the assurances of distant ministers who had never set foot in the province. They knew what they were facing. With royal support effectively withdrawn, Antoine had been recalled and no new royal hunter was sent. The responsibility for dealing with the beast fell back on the local population. The nobility of the province, men like the Marquis d'Apcher, who owned vast estates in the region, began to organize their own hunting expeditions. They offered rewards for the beast's death. They hired professional hunters. They armed their tenants and organized systematic patrols of the most dangerous areas. The Marquis d'Apcher, in particular, became deeply invested in killing the creature. He led numerous hunts himself, spending considerable time in the forests and mountains, tracking the beast through all seasons and weather. His efforts were tireless, but like everyone who had come before him, he found that spotting the beast and actually bringing it down were 2 very different things. The beast continued to kill through 1766 and into 1767. By now, the death toll was staggering. Different sources give different numbers for the total victims, and historians continue to debate which deaths should be definitively attributed to the beast versus other predators or causes. What is clear from contemporary records is that dozens of people were killed over the 3-year period, with the most reliable estimates suggesting between 60 and 100 deaths directly attributable to the attacks. The number of injured survivors was considerable as well. Entire communities had been traumatized. Children grew up with a fear that would last their entire lives. The economic impact was severe as people were afraid to tend their livestock or work in the fields alone. And still, The beast remained at large. It had survived everything that had been thrown at it. Military forces, professional wolf hunters, the king's own champion, organized hunts involving thousands of people. It had been shot at, pursued by dogs, cornered, and still it lived. Still it killed. But its time was running out, because there was one hunter who had not yet taken his final shot, one man who had been quietly preparing himself, who knew the land intimately, who had his own reasons for wanting to see the beast destroyed. His name was Jean Chastel, and according to legend, he carried with him a weapon that he believed would finally end the terror. Bullets that had been blessed by a priest, and some say, cast from silver. Jean Chastel was not a famous huntsman. He was not a member of the royal household or a professional wolf hunter with a storied career. He was a local man, a gun-bearer and huntsman who worked in the service of the Marquis d'Apcher. He was in his 60s, an age when most men would have retired from the hard and dangerous work of hunting large predators in the mountains. But Chastel had a personal stake in seeing the beast destroyed. He had been among those arrested briefly in 1765 on suspicion of somehow being involved in the attacks. A bizarre episode that speaks to the paranoia and desperation that had gripped the province. Though he was quickly released when the charges proved baseless, the stigma remained. Killing the beast would restore his honor and prove his innocence beyond any doubt. The tradition holds that Chastel was a man of deep religious faith. If the beast was a scourge allowed by God, if it was something more than a natural animal, then perhaps ordinary weapons were insufficient. Perhaps what was needed was a weapon that had been blessed, sanctified, turned into an instrument of divine will. Whether Chastel truly believed the legends about silver bullets being effective against supernatural creatures, or whether he simply wanted the most powerful spiritual protection he could obtain for his ammunition, remains a matter of speculation. But the story that has come down through the centuries is that Jean Chastel had bullets cast and taken to a priest to be blessed before the final hunt. On the 19th of June, 1767, a large hunting party organized by the Marquis d'Apcher gathered on Mont Mouchet, a mountain near the village of Saugus. It was a beautiful summer day, and the hunt had been going for hours, moving through the forests and meadows of the mountain, looking for any sign of the beast. At some point in the afternoon, Chastel found himself in a clearing at the edge of the forest. According to the most commonly told version of events, which has become legend in the region, Chastel stopped to pray. He took out his rosary and knelt, asking for God's guidance and protection. Some accounts suggest he was reading from a prayer book that he carried with him. What happened next has been the subject of debate and embellishment for more than 2 centuries. The traditional telling holds that Chastel was praying when the beast appeared at the edge of the clearing. It stood there, watching him, making no immediate move to attack. The creature simply observed him. Chastel, according to the legend, looked up from his prayers, saw the beast, and calmly said words to the effect of, "Ah, beast, you are here." He raised his musket, took careful aim, and fired. The bullet struck the beast in the chest. The creature fell, struggled briefly, and died. Other accounts are less dramatic but may be closer to what actually happened. That Chastel simply encountered the beast during the course of the hunt, fired when he had a clear shot, and was fortunate enough to hit a vital area. Whether the bullets were truly blessed, whether they contained silver, and whether these factors played any role in the success of the kill are questions that cannot be definitively answered from the historical record. What we do know is that Jean Chastel fired his musket and the beast fell dead. Whatever the exact circumstances, the result was undeniable. The beast was dead. The body was examined immediately by the hunting party. It was a large canid, though exactly how large depends on which account you consult. Various contemporary sources give different measurements, with some suggesting it was nearly 6 feet long and weighed around 130 to 140 pounds. Its coat was described as reddish-brown with dark markings, matching many of the descriptions given by survivors. Its head was unusually large, Its teeth were formidable. Its tail had the distinctive tuft that had been mentioned in so many eyewitness accounts. But what particularly struck the hunters who examined the body was what they found when it was opened. The partially digested remains of human tissue were discovered in the creature's stomach. This was proof, undeniable and horrific, that this animal had recently consumed human flesh. Jean Chastel had the body loaded onto a mule. Word spread quickly through the surrounding villages. The beast was dead. The real beast, this time. Crowds gathered to see the corpse as it was carried through towns. People who had lived in fear for 3 years finally felt they could breathe again. A decision was made to transport the body to Versailles so that the court could examine it. But this was June, and the journey would take days, perhaps weeks. The summer heat and the delay in preservation meant that by the time the corpse arrived at the royal court, it had decomposed significantly. The stench was reportedly overwhelming. The court examined what remained, but there was no grand presentation to the king, no official ceremony like the one that had celebrated Antoine's kill. The remains were disposed of, and the whole affair was quietly allowed to fade from official memory. The court had been embarrassed once before by prematurely declaring victory. This time, there would be no grand pronouncements, just a quiet acknowledgement that something had been killed. But in Gévaudan, the impact was immediate and undeniable. The attacks stopped. After the 19th of June, 1767, there were no more killings attributed to the beast. No more victims were found with their throats torn out. The terror that had gripped the province for 3 years was over. Jean Chastel became a local hero, though he received no royal reward, no pension, no official recognition from Versailles. The crown had already spent its political capital celebrating Antoine's kill. Chastel's success was an implicit rebuke to that premature victory celebration, so it was not officially honored. Chastel died 2 years later in 1769 at the age of 67 and was buried in his local churchyard. His grave has become a place of pilgrimage for those interested in the story of the beast. The musket he used, which tradition holds was loaded with blessed bullets, has been preserved and is now displayed at a museum dedicated to the beast in the village of Sauges, a testament to one of the most bizarre and terrifying chapters in the history of France. In the more than 250 years since Jean Chastel killed the creature on Montmouchet, countless theories have been proposed about the true nature of the Beast of Gévaudan. What was it? How could a single animal, or even multiple animals, cause such devastation and elude capture for so long? The question has obsessed historians, zoologists, and amateur investigators for generations. The most straightforward explanation, and the one favored by most mainstream historians, is that the beast was an unusually large and aggressive wolf, or a pack of wolves. Wolves were common in 18th century France. They were a genuine threat to livestock and occasionally to humans. In times of famine or harsh winters, when their natural prey was scarce, wolves would sometimes attack people, particularly children who were alone and vulnerable. The European gray wolf can grow quite large, with males occasionally reaching weights of 130 to 140 pounds or more, particularly in areas with abundant prey. A particularly large individual wolf, possibly one that had learned to associate humans with easy prey, could potentially account for many of the attacks. The unusual coloration described by witnesses could be explained by normal variation within wolf populations. The apparent difficulty in killing the beast with musket fire could be the result of several factors: the crude accuracy of 18th century firearms, the thick winter coat of a large wolf, the tendency of frightened people to miss vital areas, and the adrenaline-driven resilience that allows wounded animals to continue moving even after receiving injuries that will eventually prove fatal. But this explanation, while reasonable, does not easily account for all the evidence. Wolves, even large aggressive wolves, do not typically exhibit the kind of focused predation on humans that the beast displayed. Documented fatal wolf attacks on humans are extremely rare in the historical record, and sustained campaigns of predation on human communities are virtually unknown. The beast's apparent preference for human victims over the abundant livestock in the region suggests something unusual in its behavior. This has led some researchers to propose that the beast was not a pure wolf, but a hybrid, perhaps the offspring of a wolf and a large domestic dog. Wolf-dog hybrids can be extremely unpredictable and dangerous. They may inherit the size and strength of the wolf parent, combined with a reduced fear of humans from the dog parent. Such hybrids can indeed be more aggressive toward humans than either parent species. There is some circumstantial support for this theory. The unusual coloration of the beast, particularly the reddish-brown fur with dark striping, is more commonly seen in certain breeds of large dogs than in pure wolves. The massive head and broad chest, described by witnesses, could suggest admixture with a dog breed like a mastiff or similar large working dog. The apparent variation in the beast's appearance, with some witnesses describing it as more wolf-like and others insisting it looked more like a dog, could be explained if there were multiple hybrid animals involved in the attacks, perhaps offspring of the same parents with varying degrees of wolf or dog characteristics. A more exotic theory proposes that the beast was not a canid at all, but an escaped exotic animal. Some have suggested it might have been a young lion or a striped hyena brought back from France's colonial territories in Africa or the Middle East. This would explain the unusual appearance, the reddish coloration, the massive head and powerful build, the devastating bite force. There were traveling menageries in France during this period, shows that featured exotic animals for public entertainment. Could such an animal have escaped or been deliberately released in Gévaudan? The problems with this theory are significant. There is no documentary evidence for such an escape, which seems unlikely to have gone unrecorded given the extensive paperwork required for such entertainments. Exotic animals like lions or hyenas would face serious challenges surviving in the harsh climate of the Gévaudan Mountains, particularly during winter. Moreover, the behavior of the beast does not closely match the hunting patterns of lions or hyenas. The tracks found at attack sites were consistently described as canid in nature by experienced hunters. Perhaps the most controversial theory is that the attacks involved human agency, that one or more people trained large dogs or wolf-dog hybrids to kill on command, using the animals as cover for what were essentially murders. According to this theory, which has been proposed by several French investigators and forms the basis of books and documentaries, the unusual aspects of the attacks, the apparent staging of some bodies, the removal of clothing, certain patterns in the wounds, make more sense if humans were directing or participating in the killings. Proponents of this theory point to several circumstantial elements. Jean Chastel and his family, including his son Antoine, were arrested and held on suspicion during the investigation. While Jean was released quickly, Antoine was held for several months before being released without charge. The question remains, why would the authorities suspect these particular individuals if there was not some reason to investigate them? Some versions of this theory suggest that the Chastels or others may have been training animals for hunting purposes and that these animals got out of control, though this is highly speculative. More extreme versions of this theory enter the realm of conspiracy, suggesting the attacks were part of a plot to embarrass the monarchy, or that they were carried out by someone for personal gratification. These theories are not taken seriously by most historians, as they require assuming a level of organization and malevolence that is not supported by evidence, but they reflect the enduring difficulty of explaining all aspects of the case with a simple animal attack scenario. Modern scientific analysis has been limited by the available evidence. The wolf killed by François Antoine in 1765 has been preserved and examined by researchers. Studies conducted in the 1990s analyzed the mounted specimen and concluded it was indeed an unusually large wolf, but found no clear evidence of it being a hybrid or having obvious physical abnormalities that would explain extraordinary behavior. Of course, this analysis is only useful if Antoine's wolf was actually the beast, which the resumption of attacks 2 months later strongly suggests it was not. The animal killed by Jean Chastel in 1767 was not preserved in a condition that would allow for modern scientific analysis. We have only the descriptions written at the time, which are detailed but not sufficient for definitive identification of species or determination of whether it was a hybrid. The truth is that we may never know with absolute certainty what the Beast of Gévaudan really was. The evidence is too fragmentary, too contradictory, too degraded by time. What we do know is that something killed dozens of people in south-central France over a 3-year period, that it displayed unusual behavior for a wolf, and that it required extraordinary efforts to finally bring down. The Beast of Gévaudan may have been a wolf, a hybrid, an exotic animal, or something involving human agency. But whatever its biological reality, it became something more in the collective imagination of the people who lived through those years. It became the embodiment of primal fear, a reminder that humanity's control over the natural world was far more fragile than the philosophers of the Enlightenment wanted to believe. The final accounting of the beast's victims is a matter of ongoing historical debate. Different sources give different numbers, depending on which attacks are considered credible and which victims are definitively attributed to the beast, as opposed to other predators or other causes of death. Contemporary records are incomplete and sometimes contradictory. Not all deaths in rural Gévaudan would have been officially recorded, and the chaos of the period meant that documentation was inconsistent. Based on the research of historians who have examined parish registers, official correspondence, and contemporary accounts, the most reliable estimates suggest that the beast killed between 60 and 100 people during the 3 years from June 1764 to June 1767. Some estimates go higher, reaching 120 or more, while the most conservative assessments suggest around 50 to 60 deaths can be definitively attributed to the attacks. In addition to those killed, at least 70 people are recorded as having survived attacks by the beast, many of them bearing terrible scars for the rest of their lives. The psychological trauma extended far beyond the direct victims to encompass entire communities. These numbers need to be understood in context. The population of Gévaudan at the time was somewhere around 70,000 people. Over a 3-year period, the beast killed roughly 1 in every 700 to 1,000 inhabitants of the province. This represents an extraordinarily high rate of predation by any historical standard, far exceeding any other documented case of animal attacks in European history. The majority of the victims were women and children, particularly young people between the ages of roughly 5 and 20 who were tending livestock alone in the fields and forests. This demographic pattern is consistent with a predator targeting the most vulnerable and isolated members of the population. Adult men, especially those who were armed or in groups, were rarely attacked successfully, which aligns with the behavior of an intelligent predator that assessed risk. But the true legacy of the beast goes far beyond the death toll. The attacks left deep scars on the collective psyche of the region that persisted for generations. Shepherding practices changed, with people refusing to send their children out alone or ensuring that they went in groups and were armed. Some pastoral land was abandoned out of fear. The economic impact on a region that was already poor and struggling was significant. The story of the beast became embedded in the folk memory of the region, passed down through families, embellished with each retelling until it took on the quality of legend. The beast became a warning, a cautionary tale used to keep children from wandering too far from home. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as interest in folklore and local history grew, the story of the Beast of Gévaudan was rediscovered by a wider audience. Researchers began to comb through archives, reading original reports, letters from ministers, testimony of survivors. The first comprehensive modern study was published in the 20th century, attempting to separate documented facts from later embellishments and to create a reliable chronology of the attacks. Since then, dozens of books have been written about the beast in multiple languages. Television documentaries have been produced. Feature films have taken the story and transformed it into entertainment, most notably the 2001 French film Brotherhood of the Wolf, which imagined the beast as part of an elaborate conspiracy. While historically inaccurate in many ways, the film introduced the story to a global audience and sparked renewed interest in the case. In the region itself, the beast has become part of the tourism economy. The village of Sauges houses a museum dedicated to the beast, displaying artifacts related to the attacks, including the musket attributed to Jean Chastel. Statues have been erected, including the monument to Marie-Jeanne Vallée. Walking tours visit sites associated with famous attacks. The creature that once brought terror to the province now brings visitors and revenue, a strange transformation but one that seems fitting for something that has always existed as much in imagination as in reality. The Beast of Gévaudan represents a unique moment in history. It was one of the first media sensations of the modern age, a story that spread across Europe through newspapers, that captivated public imagination and demonstrated the power of the press to shape opinion. It was a story that embarrassed one of the most powerful monarchies in Europe and forced the crown to take action. It was a story that brought together ancient superstitions and Enlightenment rationalism in an uneasy mixture. The beast also occupies an interesting place in the history of werewolf folklore. By the 18th century, belief in werewolves was declining among educated classes. The age of witch hunts was over. Werewolves were becoming figures of folk tales rather than genuine threats requiring legal intervention. But the Beast of Gévaudan brought those old fears rushing back. Here was something that seemed to confirm ancient legends, a creature that appeared difficult to kill by ordinary means, that possessed unusual intelligence, that targeted humans with focused violence. The blessed silver bullets that tradition attributes to Jean Chastel became part of werewolf mythology, a motif that would be repeated in countless horror stories and films in the centuries to come. The idea that werewolves can only be killed with silver bullets, which was not universal in the oldest werewolf legends, may have been reinforced or popularized by this historical event, though the connection between silver and supernatural creatures has older roots. Today, more than 250 years after the last attack, the Beast of Gévaudan continues to fascinate. It represents something primal, something that speaks to deep fears about the fragility of civilization and the presence of true malevolence in the world, whether natural or otherwise. It reminds us that there was a time, not so very long ago, when humans were not the undisputed masters of their environment, when something could hunt us with apparent impunity. The mountains and forests of what was once Gévaudan are still there, still wild in places, still capable of swallowing the unwary. The villages where the attacks took place still exist, their stone houses and narrow streets little changed in some cases from the 18th century. The descendants of survivors still live there, carrying in their family histories the legacy of those terrible years. And on quiet nights, when the wind howls down from the high plateaus and the shadows gather thick beneath the trees, it is not difficult to imagine that something might still be out there, watching from the darkness. The story of the Beast of Gévaudan is many things. It is a historical mystery that may never be fully solved. It is a documented case of terror that reads like horror fiction but is grounded in verifiable fact. It is a moment when the ancient world of folklore and superstition collided with the modern world of science and journalism. It is an example of how vulnerable humans were, and perhaps in some ways still are, to forces beyond their immediate control. But more than anything, it is a story about the people who lived through those years, who faced an incomprehensible terror, and found within themselves the courage to keep going, to keep fighting, to refuse to become victims. It is about Jacques Portefeuille and his 6 companions, children who fought off a deadly predator with nothing but small knives and absolute determination. It is about Marie-Jeanne Vallée, who stood her ground at a river and drove a blade into the beast's chest. It is about all the unnamed shepherds and farmers who went out into the fields day after day, knowing that danger might be waiting, because the work had to be done and life had to continue. It is about human resilience in the face of the unknown, about the refusal to surrender to fear, about the capacity of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. The beast is dead. It died on a summer day in 1767, killed by a local hunter with a musket and, if the legend is true, bullets that had been blessed. But the memory lives on, carried forward through the generations, a reminder of a time when the wilderness still held very real dangers, and heroes were made not in palaces but in the mountains and forests, not with royal commissions but with simple courage and an iron determination to survive. The tale of the Beast of Gévaudan belongs to a specific time and place, the mountains of south-central France in the 18th century. But it is also a universal story, one that speaks to fundamental human experiences. Our fear of predators and what might lurk beyond the light, our need to make sense of senseless violence, our desperate hope that evil, in whatever form it takes, can be defeated. In the end, perhaps that is why the story endures. Not because we know with certainty what the beast really was, but because we understand what it represented, the chaos that always lurks just beyond the edge of civilization, waiting for a moment of weakness, waiting for us to let down our guard. The Beast of Gévaudan reminds us that the world can be a dangerous place, that there are still things we do not fully understand, and that threats, whether they walk on 4 legs or 2, are never quite as far away as we would like to believe. But it also reminds us that humans are not helpless victims, that we can face terror and fight back, that a 12-year-old boy with a small knife and 6 companions can drive off a monster, that a young woman with a makeshift spear can make a beast bleed, that a determined hunter who refuses to give up can finally bring down the creature that eluded everyone else. The Beast of Gévaudan is long dead. Its bones are dust, scattered somewhere in the soil of the mountains it once terrorized. But the story lives on, passed down through the centuries, a dark legend that refuses to fade, a tale of terror that still has the power to captivate us when we hear it told. And perhaps, in some way, that is fitting, because as long as we remember the beast, as long as we tell its story, we also remember those who stood against it. We remember their courage, their sacrifice, their refusal to submit to fear. We remember that in the darkest moments, when all hope seems lost and the threat seems invincible, ordinary people can become heroes. The mountains of what was once Gévaudan stand today much as they stood in 1764 when the terror began. The forests are still deep and dark. The rivers still run cold through their ancient gorges. The villages still cling to the slopes, their stone houses weathered by centuries of wind and rain. Tourists come now to walk the paths where the beast once hunted, to visit the museums and monuments that commemorate the attacks, to try to understand how such a thing could have happened. But the people who live there, the descendants of those who survived, carry a different kind of knowledge. They carry the stories that were passed down through their families, the memories that have been kept alive across the generations. They know that their ancestors faced something terrible and survived. They know that the world can be a dangerous place, that nature is not always benign, that there are forces that can harm us. And they know something else as well. They know that humans are meant to fight back. We are meant to light a fire, to take up a weapon, to stand together and face whatever comes. The Beast of Gévaudan taught that lesson at a terrible price, but it is a lesson that endures. In the museum in Sauges, visitors can see the musket that tradition attributes to Jean Chastel. It is an ordinary weapon by the standards of its time, the kind that thousands of hunters in 18th century France would have carried. There is nothing obviously special about it, nothing that screams of magic or miracle. The silver bullets, if they ever truly existed, are long gone, fired into the body of the beast and lost to history. What remains is simply a tool, a piece of wood and metal that was used by a determined man to end a reign of terror. That, perhaps more than any of the theories about what the beast really was, is the true heart of the story. It is not ultimately about monsters and mysteries, though those are certainly part of the tale. It is about human beings who refused to accept their role as victims, who took whatever weapons they could find, blessed them with whatever faith they possessed, and went out to face the darkness. The Beast of Gévaudan has become many things over the centuries since its death. It has been a cautionary tale, a tourist attraction, a subject of scholarly research, a source of entertainment in films and books. It has been used as evidence for werewolves, for cryptids, for government conspiracies, for the enduring power of nature to resist human control. Different people have found different meanings in the story, have used it to support different ideas and theories. But underneath all of these interpretations, underneath all the speculation and theorizing and myth-making, there is a simple and undeniable truth. In the 1760s, in a remote corner of France, something terrible happened. People died, families were torn apart, an entire province lived in fear for 3 years. And then, a group of people, ordinary people with no special powers or privileges, decided that enough was enough. They hunted the beast. They tracked it through forests and mountains. They fought it, and shot at it, and stabbed at it, and refused to give up, until finally, on a summer day in 1767, an old man with a musket brought it down. That is the story. That is what happened, as best as we can reconstruct it from the historical record. Everything else, all the theories and legends and supernatural embellishments, are layers that have been added over time. Attempts to make sense of something that defied easy explanation, to find meaning in tragedy, to transform horror into legend. And perhaps that transformation is necessary. Perhaps we need our monsters to be more than animals, more than mere predators acting on instinct. Perhaps we need them to carry symbolic weight, to represent something larger, because that makes them worthy opponents. If the beast was just a large wolf or a pack of hybrids, then the terror it caused might seem disproportionate. But if it was something more, something that required blessed weapons and acts of heroism to defeat, then the fear was justified and the victory meaningful. The truth, as is so often the case, likely lies somewhere in between the mundane and the mythical. The beast was probably an animal, perhaps an unusual one, perhaps one or more animals that had learned to associate humans with easy prey. But in the minds of the people who faced it, in the context of their world and their beliefs, it became something more. It became the embodiment of everything they feared, every ancient nightmare, every dark story told to children. And in rising to defeat it, those people became something more as well. They became heroes, not in the sense of superhuman warriors from ancient myths, but in the truer and more powerful sense of ordinary individuals who found extraordinary courage when it was needed most. Jacques Portefeuille was just a 12-year-old shepherd boy until the moment he stood his ground and led his companions in fighting off the beast. Marie-Jeanne Vallée was just a young servant until she drove a weapon into a monster's chest. Jean Chastel was just an aging local hunter until he loaded his musket and set out to do what kings and armies had failed to do. The beast made them heroes. And in a strange way, they made the beast immortal, because we are still talking about it, still wondering about it, still trying to understand it more than 250 years after it died. The beast has long since turned to dust, but the story lives on, growing and changing with each generation that encounters it, but never quite disappearing, never quite being forgotten. In the 21st century, we like to think we have moved beyond such fears. We have electric lights to drive back the darkness. We have weapons far more powerful than blessed musket balls. We have science to explain the world and technology to control it. We do not, for the most part, believe in werewolves or divine scourges or monsters that cannot die. But every so often, something happens that reminds us how thin the veneer of civilization really is. A pandemic emerges and spreads across the world, and suddenly we are confronted with the reality that nature can still kill us by the millions, despite all our science. A natural disaster strikes, and we see how quickly order can break down, how fast we can return to a state of primal fear. And in those moments, the story of the Beast of Gévaudan does not seem quite so distant, quite so irrelevant to our modern lives, because the fundamental situation has not changed as much as we would like to believe. We are still vulnerable. We are still mortal. There are still forces in the world that can harm us, that do not care about our laws or our technology or our sense of superiority. And when those forces strike, we are forced to rely on the same qualities that the people of Gévaudan relied on: courage, determination, the willingness to face danger rather than hide from it, the capacity to come together as a community and support each other through the darkness. The Beast of Gévaudan is not just history. It is not just an interesting mystery from the past. It is a mirror, showing us something fundamental about the human condition. It shows us our vulnerability, yes, but also our strength. It shows us that we can be prey, but also that we can be hunters. It shows us that monsters are real, in whatever form they take, but also that heroes are real, and that heroism is not something reserved for legends and myths, but something that any person can embody when the moment demands it. In the end, that may be why this story has endured when so many other tales of animal attacks and local tragedies have been forgotten. It is not just about a beast. It is about us. It is about what we become when we are pushed to our limits, when everything comfortable and safe is stripped away, and we are left with nothing but our choices. Do we run? Do we hide? Do we submit to fear? Or do we stand firm, take up whatever weapons we can find, and fight back? The people of Gévaudan answered that question. The children who drove off the beast with small knives answered it. Marie-Jeanne Vallée answered it at a stream with a weapon in her hands. Jean Chastel answered it on a mountain with a musket and, according to tradition, a prayer on his lips. They answered it with their actions, with their courage, with their blood when necessary. And in doing so, they created a story that would outlive them all. A story that would be told and retold for centuries. A story that would remind future generations that monsters can be defeated and that ordinary people, when pushed to extremity, can do extraordinary things. The Beast of Gévaudan is gone. The terror is over. The mountains are as safe now as any wild place can ever be. But the story remains, carried forward through time. A dark legend from a darker age. A tale of terror and courage that still has the power to move us, to frighten us, to inspire us. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is all any story can hope to do. To survive, to be remembered, to speak across the centuries to people who never knew the original tellers, never walked the ground where the events took place, but who can still understand, still feel, still connect with the fundamental human experiences at the heart of the tale. The beast walked the mountains of Gévaudan for 3 years. It killed dozens of people. It terrorized an entire province, humiliated a king, and defied every attempt to stop it until a local hunter finally brought it down on a summer day in 1767. That is the story of the Beast of Gévaudan, a true story, as best as we can piece it together from historical documents and eyewitness accounts. A terrible story, a story that speaks to our deepest fears and our highest aspirations. A story that will not die, cannot die, as long as there are people who understand that the darkness is real. The threats are real, but so is the courage to face them. The mountains remember. The stones remember. The rivers remember. And we remember, carrying forward the tale of the beast and the heroes who stood against it. keeping alive a piece of history that is also, in its way, a piece of mythology, a fragment of truth wrapped in legend, a story that belongs to the past but speaks to every age. The beast is dead, the heroes are dead, but the story lives on, whispered in the darkness, told around fires, written in books and shown on screens, changing with each telling but never losing its essential power, its ability to remind us of what we were, what we are, and what we might need to become when threats emerge. Because they will come, in different forms, with different names, but challenges will come. That is the nature of existence. The darkness never truly goes away. The wild places still hold dangers. The unknown still waits beyond the edge of our light. But if the story of the Beast of Gévaudan teaches us anything, it teaches us this: we do not have to face those dangers alone. We do not have to submit to fear. We can stand together, take up our weapons, bless them if we choose, and walk out into the darkness to face whatever waits for us there. That is the legacy of the beast. Not terror, though terror was certainly part of the story. Not mystery, though the mystery endures and may never be fully solved. The true legacy is courage, the kind of courage that transforms ordinary people into heroes, that turns potential victims into warriors, that refuses to accept defeat even when defeat seems inevitable. The Beast of Gévaudan walked the earth for 3 years and then was gone, killed by a bullet from an ordinary musket. But the story, the lesson, the truth at the heart of the tale walks on, carried forward by every person who hears it and understands what it means. In the mountains of former Gévaudan, the wind still howls through the forests. The shadows still gather thick beneath the trees. The old paths still wind through the wilderness where the beast once hunted. But the villages are lit now, warm against the darkness. The people still tend their flocks, still work their fields, still live their lives, because they remember. They remember the beast, and they remember those who stood against it. They remember that monsters can be defeated, and darkness can be overcome. They remember that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. And they remember Jean Chastel, a local hunter who walked into the forest one summer day and did not come back until the beast was dead, and the terror was over, and the people could finally, after 3 long years of nightmare, breathe freely again. That is the story. That is the truth we can verify from historical records. That is the legend of the Beast of Gévaudan, told now as it has been told for more than 250 years. A tale of darkness and light, of monsters and heroes, of terror overcome and courage rewarded. The story is ended, but the memory endures. And as long as it endures, as long as we remember the beast and those who fought it, the lesson remains alive. That we are not helpless before darkness, that we can fight back, that we can prevail.